The AI Dilemma, 7 Principles for Responsible Technology. Now, AI holds incredible promise to improve almost every aspect of our lives, but we cannot ignore its risks, its mishaps and misuses. The AI Dilemma is a book that offers 7 powerful principles that businesses can use to end the harm. Now, Juliet, Art, are you both, and maybe you can answer individually in this case, are you in the opinion that AI can fulfill all of its promises while avoiding harm? Quite a big question to start the conversation.
I guess it depends what the promise is in your mind. And I think that's part of the overall issue is, are we developing artificial intelligence for the human race or for the arms race? Or perhaps for the technological race? And until we actually answer those questions, I think that there will continue to be many harms. But at the same time, there are many, many, many different things that we all care about as humans that could easily be taken care of by AI, for example, climate change. If we decided to throw all of our attention and all of our technology to fixing that specific problem, we could do it. But I think that there's this imperative in the sense that it's the Wild West out there, and many of the companies that are developing the technology are really focused on making money while we can.
Definitely. So in the theory that you mentioned there, the technological race, the human race, the arms race, would you say that there's one that has a more focused presence in terms of the harm that could potentially occur from that particular race that you've mentioned?
Well, I think that many people that are focused on geopolitics are terrified, right? Looking at the race between China and the United States for AI supremacy, both countries have put forth very specific and clear roadmaps. And we've also seen how businesses have rallied behind those imperatives. At the same time, I think that many people in the European Union, as they're developing the Artificial Intelligence Act, are very much focused on human rights. And so how do we as a global community balance those things in a way that's actually representative of all of us as opposed to the few that actually have power in this space?
Very much so. I mean, we saw recently as well that the development of the AI Act in the European Union has certainly benefited cases like misrepresentation through the misuse or the inaccurate detection through facial recognition that has happened, I think, many times now in the US. What about you, Art? Are you in the opinion that AI can fulfill all of its promises while avoiding harm?
Well, first of all, everything Juliet said, I totally agree with. When it comes to a corporation, I don't think very many corporate leaders are really trying to do harm, but I think there aren't the practices and attitudes needed to oversee, a technology that often acts on its own, a set of technologies that often act on its own. So when we say, what is AI doing? We're really asking, what are the companies that are putting forth the software and the algorithms and the machine learning models? What are they doing, and what are the users doing? And we're talking about, what skills can a company develop among its leadership and among, all of the staff, all of the employees, to not have unintended consequences. It's not something that happens by itself.
Can you expand on some of those skills that you would list then that a company should be in a position of willingness to want to develop?
Well, a lot of them are things like, can you have the kinds of conversations where you're thinking not just about the immediate short-term returns, but you're also thinking about the implications for the people who will be using it, maybe some of the vulnerable populations, maybe some of your constituents in different parts of the world. And, if it's misused and it comes back to you, that's one set of skills. And then, we cover that in the chapter called Creative Friction in our book. There's another set of skills that have to do with how you handle problematic cases, problematic information. Do you have the systems in place to make sure that it goes to the right people and gets managed correctly?
Mm-hmm. And we're definitely going to pick up on that component of creative friction later on in the discussion. So hi, everyone. It's Lauren Hawker-Zaffer. Welcome back to Redefining AI, the Tech Podcast. Now, today I have been joined by Juliet Powell and Art Kleiner, the co-authors of The AI Dilemma, 7 Principles for Responsible Technology. So welcome again, Juliet and Art. It's a great pleasure to have you here with me today on Redefining AI.
Thank you.
So I'd like to start, let's go back a little bit with your expression and the book per se. So which path and realizations led you both to the co-authorship of this book in question?
So I'll be very honest with you, Lauren. I decided to go back to school. There was a period in my life where I was taking care of my mom, and when she passed away, it was one of these make or break moments. And I decided to really put my head down and learn as much as I possibly could outside of the tech arena where I'd been navigating for the last 10 to 15 years, just getting a sense of how others thought about technology and its impact on society. And through that process, I wrote a dissertation with the idea that, I'd love to turn this into a book. I don't want to just, get a piece of paper, put it on the wall. Can I actually contribute something that's useful to others? And Art and I had collaborated in the past when he was editor-in-chief of Strategy and Business at a publication published by PwC. And Art, I really look to you to tell me the truth. Was this worthy of a book? Did it make sense to spend more time? And Art gave me a yes. Now, why he gave me a yes, I'm not sure. Art, I'm going to throw it back to you. What were you thinking?
I was thinking this is the moment when AI crosses a threshold. People are going to be using it not just, I knew from PwC and from, a long career in covering technology that often things that start as very small contained efforts, when they grow to world-size scale, people change the way they work and then change the way they live. And it was obvious that was going to be happening here. It was also obvious from reading the dissertation, A, that there were unintended consequences that we as society had not yet dealt with. B, that there were huge benefits and that companies everywhere were going to be taking advantage of them and changing themselves, transforming the way they did things in the process. And C, there wasn't yet a book that put these two things together from a business perspective. And I actually believe we were first to do that.
There's so much to unpack in that. So congratulations for going back to school. I'm an advocate of lifelong learning, so that's amazing in itself. You obviously were thinking about tech, the impact that it has on society, which we could question, is everyone thinking about that impact, which would then go to maybe Art's comment around the AI has actually crossed a threshold. If we look at two of the comments that you made about unintended consequences and benefits of the technology, and this threshold that has been crossed, again, linked to the implication on society, where is everyone in this whole web of understanding, not understanding, wanting to understand, explainability, transparency, possibility? Art, maybe you can comment on that.
So there's two parts to that. The first is, where is everybody in their understanding? And I think AI has been like a forcing function for humanity. It's forced us to look at the decisions that we all make and the biases inherent in those decisions, because it crystallizes them and solidifies them and automates them and turns them, makes it harder to change them in some ways and makes it easier to act on them. So, people are paying attention to decision making in a way that they might not have been before. And then how do you make it explainable? And we should probably talk more about this, but, I noticed, for instance, that your own site and Squirrel talks a lot about helping people set up systems that have explainability built into the technology. And we have, the track record for consequences is not that great. There have been a lot of mistakes and a lot of harm. And part of the answer is allowing people to question when an AI program or an AI system has done something. Why was it set up? Who set it up? What was its purpose? What was built into the model? How was the data gathered? All that stuff. And, we're still learning how to develop answers to those questions.
Not just that, but just kind of looking at the learning curve around LLMs, generative technology overall. We're talking about situational awareness for the LLM. In other words, the LLM actually realizing that it's an LLM and potentially modifying its own behavior and safety tests before deployment. We're looking at that in, the next year to 2 years. But 2024 is around the corner, and I'm seeing projections of this happening by the end of 2024 or early 2025.
And I think that that's a component that's also extremely important. And I've heard a lot of people talk about it in the last couple of weeks, that the speed is almost, you can't catch up. And especially if you're immersed in the actual tech ecosystem. I mean, there's constantly a release about the integration of computer vision. I mean, we just have to look at the integration of DALL-E into ChatGPT. And we're not only working with data sets that are historical data up until 2021, there's now the very ever-present opportunity to interact with all data sets, which then goes back to the question of the automation of the biases that are brought in because of the data set and the data that's extracted. So, it's almost like, is it possible to catch up on everything that should be addressed and that you want to say, stop, well, wait a minute, we need to address X, Y, Z? Maybe let's look at, so you wrote the book, but who is then the targeted reader?
Well, since you were kind enough to read at least part of the book, you probably got up to the point where we talk about the four logics. And that actually emerged during the research for the book. But I think that once it was clear that it was going to be a book and not just a dissertation, and Art jumping on board as co-author, not just guider or advisor, actually an equal author, it became very, very clear how differently Art and I thought about these different things because we have different experiences, different contexts. And so this idea of four logics is a reflection of what we saw out there, but also in terms of our own interaction as co-authors. Now, this corporate logic, which is very, very different in many cases from the engineering logic, the government logic, which we're really starting to see emerge now as government tries to figure out regulation. And then, of course, the social justice logic, which, there's always a fight inside of me between the engineering logic and the social justice logic. And wait a minute, we also have to make money. How do we balance all of these things? And being able to speak with people with varying hats on, if you will, and trying to keep all of these different logics in mind as you're actually thinking this through, I think is incredibly important because we want to be able to make the best technology for the most amount of people. But as you said, the rate of change is happening so quickly. I have no idea how that actually works within an actual bureaucracy. Art, you've worked within bureaucracy. It's slow. It takes time. And we're also suggesting the idea of creative friction, which takes even more time because it takes longer to deliberate. So how do you make that work within a large organization, Art?
Well, typically what an organization does is it hires specialists. So, I worked at PwC and we had specialists working on AI internally who were helping staff people learn to code their own automated systems. And we had specialists who work with clients because it's a consulting firm and an accounting firm and an auditing firm. And in all of those cases, there was a huge temptation to delegate all of the responsibility for our specialists will learn it, they'll know about it, and when we need it, we'll call on them. As both of you, I think, know, that doesn't tend to work when you're actually creating an ingrained system that is intimately interwoven with everything your company is doing. And, most companies care about quality as well as making money. So now the skills of the specialist have to be instilled and developed, both in the way people use the systems and in the training they get. The best companies do that. A lot of companies don't do that. And we're starting to see how that translates into different kinds of results.
And how do you do that as well? I mean, we mentioned about the ever impending necessity to commercialize as well. So to meet maybe quarterly targets, etc. How would an organization find that balance? Maybe Juliet, or you can.
Very imperfectly. From what I can tell. And I say this after, again, speaking with, hundreds of people within big tech, but also independent companies, not-for-profit companies from different parts of the world, different cultures, different reasons for deploying the technology itself. And there seems to be in larger organizations this, at least in certain departments, this realization that you have to do a calculus of intentional risk. I think many of the responsible AI divisions within big tech are coming from this perspective. Yes, we have all this technology, and yes, we can positively change the world with it. But there could also be harm to billions of people. And ultimately, it's our responsibility, if we're deploying this, to make sure that we don't make a mess of it, especially if there's no going back once deployed. And I think that the larger the organization, the larger the user base, the more responsibility those organizations are feeling. But of course, and I found this out, well before LLMs were deployed, looking at, what it takes for an organization to self-regulate. You can have the best of intentions when you start out, right? Do no evil, and let's make sure that everybody has access to this technology and the democratization of all things digital and AI. And at the same time, how much is that going to cost you reputationally if people, like billions of people, are harmed by your technology? And what happens once the AIA out of the European Union actually comes out, and all of a sudden you're being sanctioned, you're being fined, and you have to pay for damages, which are, 6 or 7% of your annual revenue plus subsidies plus damages. It comes out to a lot of money. It's interesting that, you think that because the technology is moving so quickly, that so are the organizations, but at the same time, many of them are still just kind of keep track with GDPR. So something like the AIA becomes something that's way, way down the road. But is it really?
And you mentioned, and I don't know if this is the parallel here, but in the start of, the foreword of the book, you mentioned that the cardinal recommendation is to avoid the closed box. Is this what you're mentioning here, the closed box?
Well, I think there are many different ways of looking at a closed box. It's not just the technological closed box. It's also this idea that you have to maintain trade secrets in order to have a competitive advantage, right? And when it comes to technology that essentially is automated or can program itself, that doesn't need human supervision in any way, all of a sudden we're talking about a closed box that is talking to a bunch of other closed boxes, and we really have no sense of what's going on in there. So I think that when people are having to undergo things like algorithmic sentencing, as we've seen here in the United States, you need to be able to push back as a human being against the system. You need to be able to show why it is that you are being targeted, and you need to be able to have some sort of a defense against that. And as a result, you need humans. You need explainability. You need a sense of what was weighted within the algorithm. Is it just my zip code and my skin color, or are there actually other factors? Is this just based on old and bad data, or is there something that's actually happening here? And we're seeing this all over the world, places like Amazon, for example, where, people are literally working with AI systems, but they're also competing against AI systems, and their bosses are AI systems all simultaneously, and they have no real sense of how they're being measured in any of these dimensions.
I mean, if we look at that in respect to the consideration that has to be taken when we're talking about transparency as well, I mean, the example of algorithmic sentencing, then again, we're going to an ecosystem that is not only made up of, people that are technically literate, you've also got people that are non-technical. And can we expect, or is it even possible, that non-technical people can challenge the provenance and assumptions of a closed system?
Well, I do think that it's important to note that we don't just have to use closed systems. There are other systems out there that are actually open source, that are transparent. It is really up to each and every organization to decide what kind of systems that they're going to be deploying. You don't have to buy a closed box system. You don't have to buy something that's off the shelf, that's controlled by a third party. There are other models out there. And I think that that's something that we don't talk enough about. There are options. And I do think that within the social contract, at least as far as I understand it, that yes, there needs to be some sense of not just for the individual that's being accused, for example, in terms of algorithmic sentencing, but also for the independent auditor that's being brought in as per the AIA, to be able to look at it not just from a technical perspective, but also what is the business logic behind the system, the way that you've created the model. What about the data that's going in there? Are you, again, just taking off the shelf training data, or are you actually training this properly yourself based on the population of interest? I think that there are many, many different ways of looking at this equation, and these many different types of people have to be able to look within and weigh in. And right now, for the most part, that's just not possible.
What are your thoughts on that, Art, as well?
Well, so again, everything you said, Juliet, and maybe with a note to the decision maker who has to make sense of all this and decide how you're going to play it in your own company. I come from a background of organizational learning, and the AI dilemma is new-ish, but the dilemma about how to manage all of the competing priorities is not new. And the awareness of just how much power a company has, how limited that power is, it's often channeled in just a few places, but it is, it's pretty absolute over the people who work there and has a lot of effect on the people in the surroundings, the constituents. So what do you have to learn as a team, as an executive, in order to have the time and the perspective to get on the right side of your future decisions? And the companies that we admire the most are the ones that are thinking this way right from the beginning. And the ones that that are sort of run of the mill, they end up commodifying their decisions. So now AI can be used to commodify a lot of knowledge work. And the companies that really make it work, and the governments, are going to be the ones that don't just commodify what they already do, but say, now we have an opportunity to choose our aspirations and to choose which systems we're going to emphasize. They're going to do it for themselves based on their existing strength, because AI is gathering data about their existing strengths and their existing history. It's not coming from out of nowhere. It's reflecting what they've already done, but it's also making them perhaps more self-aware, just as the practices of organizational learning did and do, and the practices of agile decision-making did and do. So now we have all these tools, all this awareness, and can we create the kinds of cultural and systemic structures that allow, the better AI tools and the better human decisions to really be in partnership with each other? That sounds like rhetoric, but when you actually boil it down into practice, it's not a buzzword. It's a real discipline of activity.
And definitely a discipline that does provide impactful food for thought. I want to touch on one point just before we sort of usher our discussion to the end, because it's an extremely important point that we mentioned at the start. So in the last chapter, you address, we've already mentioned it a couple of times in the conversation, this principle of embracing the creative friction. And it's something that relates to the personal authority that one can possibly should take when we're interacting with automated systems, with technologies. Can you explain a little bit more about what this creative friction is in relation to the AI dilemma, Juliet?
Sure. So creative friction, I mentioned this earlier. Art and I had a lot of creative friction when we were writing this book, because we wanted it to be useful for decision makers, both within, a company as well as the engineers that are working on the systems themselves. We wanted to be readable by somebody who worked in government, who potentially had to weigh in on any kind of AI governance from a governmental perspective. And then the social justice activists who have been out there for far longer than most of us, just trying to get everybody else's attention. We wanted to be able to honor their work as well. And I think that this idea of creative friction is kind of fundamental, not just to AI, but to any great project. I studied under a wonderful professor by the name of David Stark at Columbia University, and he had done some work on Wall Street as well as the Tokyo Stock Exchange. And he was really looking at productivity. And what he found is that the most diverse teams, and here we're talking about gender, we're talking about race, but especially economic background, we're talking about cultural background, very, very different perspectives on life. The more diverse these teams are, which also included neurodiversity, the longer it took them to deliberate, because they asked more questions of each other. They pushed back against each other more. Kind of like what Art and I did while we were writing the book. What should go in here? What's not important, right? And you go back and forth, and it takes a long time, and it can be frustrating as heck. But I do think that for us, there's a better book because of it. And in terms of our AI systems, when you get more people, more diverse backgrounds, more ways of looking at things, pushing back from the outset when you're designing the system, the better the system will be for more people. And so if you're developing a system specifically for a use case for a population of interest, bring in that population of interest before you do anything at all. Talk to them. What are their potential benefits of doing it the way that you've proposed to do it? But what are some of the harms that they see? Because they're going to see things that you don't see, right? We're in front of our laptops all day. We're working on technology. We're not necessarily out in the world of the people that will become the users or targets of the specific technology that you're developing. Also, keep in mind, focus on your use case and please don't copy and paste too much. I think that's kind of key. But again, bring in those people, those different communities while you're developing the technology. Get their feedback again. What are the benefits? What are the potential worst case scenarios that you see? And then again, once you're in, alpha phase and beta phase, I think that's really, really important. As we're working using LLMs in many different ways, give that feedback to the system. Make sure that you're constantly trying to reincorporate that feedback as you're developing. And I think that just as Professor Stark found both on the Tokyo Stock Exchange as well as Wall Street, the more you have and incorporate that feedback, the longer it's going to take, but the better the results for more people. And most likely, if you're the company that's actually deploying the technology, the more money you're going to make because you're going to get sued a heck of a lot less.
Which I'm sure everyone will be happy about. In the book, you also mention the benefits in the last chapter, in the chapter that we're talking about in particular. But you also question, and it's almost like this complementary questioning angle of, we're all quite addicted to this illusion of control that's created by frictionless experiences. And you see that a lot of different organizations, depending on the resource capabilities, allocations, it's sometimes almost easier to go with the less friction environment than creating this creative friction. How would you advise organizations that are in that situation to bring in the component of creative friction?
So, well, you just nailed it, Lauren. You just got the whole core message about the illusion of control and creative friction. And it's tough to talk about. I found it very tough to hear this message when I was, a decision maker in a large company, because I was one of the best-selling books about user experience design is called Don't Make Me Think. And I really wanted not to think. I wanted life to be frictionless. And I didn't really want life to be frictionless. What I wanted was to choose where friction would pop up and where it wouldn't pop up. And I wanted that choice to be easy. The presence of AI has shown us that choice is not easy, but you can develop the muscles of your mind and the habits and practices, the cultural practices, the organizational incentives to, deal with these dilemmas as they should be dealt with, and also to make them creative. And creative is fun, right? And it makes a difference to talk with somebody who came from a different background. Juliet, you and I, in our conversations, the more fun the conversation was, the better the product was. And I think that's true of most companies that bring diverse teams in. They miss it when they don't have it. David Stark found that out. Others, other research, people crave to be in a community of people who come from different places, have a common goal, have the competence and the smarts and the character to pull that goal. They want to be in that kind of group. And when they're no longer in that kind of group, they're going to miss it. And I think we're going to see a lot of groups like that emerging as AI takes away some of the drudge work and leaves us with still the same number of challenges or more.
Hopefully. Very inspirational words to close the podcast session today. It's been a fascinating journey. I've really enjoyed the conversation with you both, Juliet and Art. And I thank you for participating and for sharing all your wisdom and experience with us today.
Thank you, Lauren.
Thank you, Lauren.
And I thank everyone else who's listened to this episode of Redefining AI today.